Okay, it looks like we are live. So I am going to start talking. So hello everyone, I'm Anu and Director of Community Initiatives and Policy at Canadian Women's Foundation. And thank you so much for joining us today. We're here to talk about some of the key issues about rebuilding the pandemic recovery as they relate to gender equality. And on this subject, the Canadian Women's Foundation, in collaboration with other organizations, is releasing a new series of reports called Resetting Normal. So today I'm joined by Pamela Upal, a policy advisor at the Ontario Nonprofit Network and one of the report's co-authors. The other organizations who contributed are Imagine Canada, the Centre for Policy Alternatives, Dr. Kathleen Leahy, and who is a feminist scholar at Queen's University. So it's really great to have you here with us, Pamela, to talk about this report.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So maybe we can just start, before we get into it, I do want to acknowledge that the work of the Canadian Women's Foundation and the programs we support takes place on First Nations, Métis and Inuit land. And we're very grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land. We recognize that the continuing legacy of colonialism that we work within and around and try to take part in dismantling as much as we can, and that within that land acknowledgements are really not enough. So we are committed to pursuing truth and reconciliation and decolonization in our ongoing efforts to make right with all our relations. So as I mentioned, our discussion today looks at how we can approach our recovery from the pandemic with a gender lens. We recently released the first in these reports to explore the risks that have been exposed by the pandemic and to propose new ways of building a gender and equal Canada as we go forward. So although the pandemic has presented us with many challenges, and some of them new, some of them really deepening existing inequalities, there are also opportunities to reflect and decide on how we can move forward together. So this first report specifically looks at reasons why it's important to fund a strong women's sector in order to achieve the goal of a gender equal Canada. One of the key points that we raise is that the women's sector was in crisis in terms of funding even before the pandemic. And now, as women are facing many gendered impacts of the pandemic, such as increased gender-based violence, economic instability, also being on the front lines of caregiving in many, many different ways, we know that a strong women's sector is needed to meet the challenges and then continue to rebuild on the other side. So we've presented some key recommendations, but maybe Pamela, you can start with giving us some background on the important work that the Ontario Nonprofit Network has done to help to quantify the state of the women's sector going into the pandemic.
Sure. There's so many different factors that have led the women's sector, which is, our women's organizations and the women's movement to where it is today. And one of the really important things that we highlighted in our co-authored paper was the way in which the women's sector, which is part of the broader nonprofit and charitable sector in Canada, has been traditionally and historically a feminized sector. So what I mean by that is that gender has played a significant role in shaping the inequitable and inadequate funding models that we see. And this is important to recognize because it directly impacts those that work in the sector, which are mostly women, the organizations, the programs that are provided, and the communities that women's organizations and the movement support, right? So ONN has been doing a lot of work around looking at particularly women workers in the nonprofit and charitable sector, which I said, again, like women's organizations are a part of. And what we found was there is a feminization of the sector and the ways in which the sector is feminized. So some of the factors include, we're 80% women workers, not just in Ontario, but across Canada. Much of the work that we do is considered care work. It's considered women's work, particularly that of racialized, immigrant, and Indigenous women. So a lot of those gendered and racialized pieces sort of converge there. And thus it's not taken seriously. It's not valued. It's considered, it should be done for free. It's charity. And the other piece is that, again, the populations that the subsector serves are primarily women and children. So what we see that comes out of that feminization are these negative gender stereotypes that sort of get built into the systems and structures of our sector. And it has real consequences, again, on organizations, on our labor force, and the communities we serve. So some of those examples are, thinking of patriarchal power systems that emerge between organizations, particularly women serving organizations, and maybe their donors, their funders, the ED, and the board. And this idea that the sector, is dependent, needs saving, needs monitoring, needs a lot of regulation, doesn't know what it's doing. And you see that at high level in terms of the whole system and the structure of our organizations, but you also see that in the labor force, right? Going back to the work that we do, it's considered low waged, low valued, it doesn't require a lot of skill. And those are all stemming from that feminization, negative gender stereotypes. And when we were writing this report, what was really important was to highlight not only that the nonprofit and charitable sector as a whole is sort of viewed in that way, but particularly women's organizations sort of bear a compounded brunt of all of this, right? The situation is a lot worse for women's organizations. Some of the things that we found in our research that we did back in 2018 was that actually women's organizations reported higher levels of not being taken seriously by funders, or being, the most low funded subsector across nonprofits and charities. A lot of the wages that women received in that sector, women workers, were less than across the board, right? And that's not just been documented by us, but CCPA has done some really great work in documenting that. And so it's really important to think about that when we think about the pandemic and any crisis, really, right? Like we have an impending climate change piece going on, or when we're thinking about truth and reconciliation, when you have these inequitable systems and structures in place before a crisis, it's going to significantly impact the way in which organizations and they can serve and function and weather during the pandemic or weather that storm. So not just during the time of the pandemic, but what happens after, right? So we need to make sure they survive this and sort of pivot the way that they need to pivot to continue serving women and other communities during this time, but also making sure that that infrastructure is there when the pandemic sort of evolves or blows over or we're in recovery phase, right? Because actually we could argue that that's when those supports are going to be needed the most. And so, it's been really interesting learning about that and reading and writing about that for the past couple of years, and such a great way or such an important piece to highlight in the report that we wrote.
And I think some of the points you made about the feminization and particularly the research that CCPA had done, we know that actually out of all the groups, the groups that are working directly on women's rights, 100%, those advocacy groups, first of all, they are 100% women staffed. And second of all, they are the worst paid. So you really see how that those two things come together to sort of create a situation where funding, is really the model is leaving women in women's rights underfunded, which then means that they're constantly struggling to catch up to demand those rights of equal pay and addressing those stereotypes.
And that labor force piece is so important, right? When we're thinking about decent work and we're thinking about our women's organizations, if we have better supported workers, 100% that are women, the better work that they're able to do, the better they're able to further the mission and mandate of our organizations, and then better able to support communities. But if you have overworked, low paid, undervalued staff doing such important work, I mean, the impact is directly on communities, right?
Yeah, on communities and then on, those individual workers, because we know that having to deal with a model that really only sets up a partial funding mechanism, right? So they're constantly running after donations and fundraising. It's periodic, it's sporadic, and in the pandemic, it's there's reports going both ways. There's reports saying that there's been a crash in the events and the capacity to do fundraising, while at the same time, Canada Helps recently reported that actually online donations to specific kinds of organizations have increased. So, but it's still always temporary, right? It's really about a fragile sector. And going forward, part of our concern is that the economic decline then has a knock-on effect in fundraising efforts. If you're saying to organizations, you don't have core funding, we're not going to fund your mission, then we really are telling them, go out and find your own money. And if that's the situation, then they're going to face the same downturn that potentially the economy will face. So that's really hard when, well, the Canadian Women's Foundation, for example, we're only able to support, because we're fundraising constantly, we're only able to support about 15% of the requests we receive. And we watched a sector in the last 10 to 15 years really go through a complete crisis, not only because of defunding, because changes in government mechanisms, but also the 2008 financial crisis. So, it's hard to imagine anything but a rethink in this circumstance, right? We've been told GBV is, a human rights issue. GBV is on the rise. So this kind of funding has to be an imperative moving forward, really.
And the important piece underneath that is data, right? Like one of the really, I think you could say this too, one of the challenging pieces in writing this paper was, getting that data. And, we don't have some national, well, we have Statistics Canada, but we don't have any, place where we can draw all this data that's up to date and current and relevant to sort of underline as the evidence in terms of what we're talking about, right? Like we really had to, out of all the authors, piece together all that data, which is why I think it's been so amazing to see so particular subsectors like women's organizations do data gathering as the pandemic started. So I'm wondering if you can, share some stuff that you found. I know Canadian Women's Foundation did a fantastic survey of women's organizations across Canada when the pandemic started. What were some sort of trends that you guys saw?
We were really surprised that right away all the organizations, surprised because the survey was across Canada and all kinds of organizations. So it wasn't necessarily just violence prevention organizations, it was all, so we fund in economic development, violence prevention, girls empowerment, and women's leadership. And actually all of the organizations without fail said, GBV rise is one of our major concerns. Then the next part after that was, of course, the economic impacts on women, and then the economic impacts on themselves as organizations. So it was really hard for us to imagine how organizations were going to be able to respond to all of those needs. So some of the things that they've said that they were doing. So we asked that question too, right? How are you doing this? So obviously a lot of them are actually increasing their services. More than 70% said while they had moved into, spaces like we're all working in now, they were actually increasing and offering more services than before because they were offering access to different sorts of food security issue, right? So they were sort of widening their scope because they were responding to exactly what women needed, like where women were at. Increased levels of anxiety meant that women who perhaps had only checked in with them, especially for sexual assault centers and shelters, women that had only checked in with them once a week were now checking in daily. And then a lot of shifting of services to trying to move on to other needs, COVID-related needs, so cleaning, sanitation, PPE, those sorts of things. So, I mean, I think it was very similar probably to some of the things that the ONN found when they did a flash survey, right? And I just want to thank, while we're on the subject, I do want to shout out to all of you organizations that are responding to our surveys. Thank you. Because this is really important data we're gathering. We're happy that we can do it, and we are so grateful for your contribution to making it possible.
And a lot of this data underpins the, what recovery is going to look like, right? And it underlines a lot of the recommendations, policy recommendations we can make and advocacy work we can do, right? And like you shared, ONN also did a flash survey back in March, right when the pandemic had started. And we had a response rate in Ontario, about 500 organizations. And we had structured the survey in a way we really wanted to know organizations serving different populations. So we were able to cut the data and find, what did those organizations that primarily serve women and the LGBTQ2S community report, right? What was their state? And sort of very much so complementary in terms of what Canadian Women's Foundation found. So it was about 125, and some of the data points that I want to share that I thought were interesting were, 78% of those organizations had reported that were experiencing or anticipating experiencing reduced revenue from fundraising. So some of those pieces I know you were talking about, right? And that's canceled events and donations. And this was actually higher than the rest of the sector. So the rest of the sector had responded at 74%. And for women's orgs, it was around 78%. And I think that's really significant, right? The other piece that I thought was interesting was that 83% of those organizations, like you said, experiencing disruption in services or anticipating disruption of services to clients and communities. 6 out of 10 reported they were open and operating. So we still had a functioning sector in that way with modified regular operations, but 19%, which is almost 1 in 5, had closed. And so that makes me think about, those that had closed, the workers, the women workers, the impact on them and their families, and the communities and the very particular services that they provided to communities. Now there's a gap there, right? And sort of how does that then get filled? And I think the data piece, again, in terms of policy recommendations, now we start thinking about like resetting normal, what's the recovery phase going to look like? And we're already sort of seeing that narrative in politics and media around, how do you get the economy open again? And what do you fund and what the stimulus looks like? What we really wanted to know was how much money does the sector need to survive? Right. And what I thought was really interesting was a lot of the women's organizations and those serving LGBTQS2S said they needed about 100,000, right, to survive the pandemic and to sort of move forward and see what the next phase looks like, which is a significant amount of money, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not a significant amount of money, right? So how do we use that in our advocacy work? How do we sort of amplify that and put a dollar amount into what investment in our sector looks like, right?
I think that's a really important point because it also points to the fact that many women's organizations are small, right? Most of them are maybe around 10 employees. There's only a few that really are in that very large scale. But going back to some of why the surveys were so important, right, is because some of the gaps, some of the things we needed to inform ourselves on were, for example, what is the size of the women's sector, right? That's a really difficult one to answer right now. And when you said at the beginning, women's sector includes those serving women for their specific issues, as well as those that are equity seeking. We've got a little bit of an interesting mishmash there. And does that include, say an organization like, a Salvation Army, right? Because they're offering shelters that include women. Would we include them in women's sector numbers? So those are some of the things that I think as the Canadian Women's Foundation, we've really realized we should be able to quantify much more clearly who is part of our sector and why we would include them.
And again, like that underpins then the policy work that we want to do in resetting the normal, right? It's a lot more efficient and effective to go to government and say, this is the size, this is the impact, this is the quantification of it, and this is what needs to change, right?
Yeah, yeah. So we were very happy that in your survey there was that piece where you had broken that, you know, by population being served, and we really hope that ongoing surveys by all kinds of networks like the Ontario Nonprofit Network continues in that vein.
And it makes it visible, right? I think one of the other pieces around women's work, care work, the work that women's organizations do, and the issues that they address can sometimes be so invisible, right? Because what gets counted is what counts, essentially, right? So, you know, making that work visible and putting a number on it is so important, particularly when we're looking at care work, right? And I was going to talk about this later, but we're working on another paper with Canadian Women's Foundation on care work and the care economy, right? And we're working on it with CCPA as well. And what's been fascinating in writing that paper is trying to put a frame around this care economy and this care work piece because it is so invisible, right? And trying to think about what do we include in it, who's part of it, but to have that conversation and that framing piece is so important because, again, that's what's going to help us make those policy recommendations in resetting normal, right?
Right, right, yeah. So maybe we should just go over our recommendations in the report, and then maybe we can talk a bit more about how people can access the report and some of the ongoing stuff. So we have a few key ones. So obviously we've talked about this already, Pamela, providing core funding to women serving organizations and equity seeking organizations for all the reasons we mentioned, that they're really an essential service, and the pandemic has shown that. We want to guarantee agenda-based analysis in policy making, which is an interesting, we chose to use that language, I think, because it speaks to government and it speaks to funders. Many other, I guess in the sector, we more commonly would talk about an intersectional approach. So they're not exactly the same thing, and I don't want to suggest they are, but the organizations we fund would use terms such as intersectionality more to address that. The data collection that we've mentioned, also with including gender and an intersectional lens in the data collection about this sector, for this sector, and I guess including this sector. And then we would like the federal government to make the gender-based analysis a requirement when it comes to transfer payments to provinces and territories with agreements regarding nonprofits and charities. So I don't know if there's any in particular there, Pamela, that you want to kind of pick up and expand on.
Yeah, I think the last one actually, because we've covered the other ones a bit and I think people have a good sense of them. But the reason why we're talking about transfer payments is so important, right? Because there's federal leadership and federal money on particular social services. And so that comes through, you know, them giving money to the provinces and territories, and the provinces and territories giving it to either municipalities, which then gets given to women's organizations or the movement, or directly from the province. And to have that gender-based lens, or to have that intersectional lens, will sort of, you know, give them a sense of where money needs to go, cash flow, right? Like, how do you flow funds to have the biggest impact versus using traditional ways in which of funding things or providing money, right? And the organization, and it's better for the communities, right? Because then you can, again, flow of money and how that money gets used and who is able to benefit from it. One of the things, you know, we always advocate for at ONN is a decent work piece. In order to support our communities, we need to support our women workers and women's organizations. And transfer payment agreements are a really, really effective way to do that.
So we actually missed a bit there, Pamela, because it was frozen for me. I think it was frozen on Facebook. So it was just after you had mentioned why the federal government leadership and the federal government use of funds is so important to push down to provinces. So if you could just repeat that a little bit, that would be great.
Yes, I'll just try to remember what I said. But really, like the point that I wanted to underscore there was that transfer payment agreements are so important, right? Particularly when it comes to women's organizations, it's the binding contract between you and the funder, the governmental funder. In this case, it could be municipal, provincial, or federal, and it governs how much money you get, for how long you get it, what you can use it for, and what those budget lines are, right? So if you can have that intersectional lens apply to transfer payment agreements, it's twofold. One, we can then track, actually how much money is going into the women's organizations and women's sector, and if it's being effective or not. But also making sure, you sort of raise the floor around wages when it comes to the sector, raise the floor in terms of how much money sexual assault centers are getting or women's shelters are getting. And so I think it's such an effective tool to really make visible the care work, the value of care work in our sector that happens, and not have it be so low waged and low funded. Yeah.
Right. So I am going to ask you, we do have some questions, I think, coming online. So here we go. It says, is there a way to quantify, this is a great follow-up question for what you were talking about. Is there a way to quantify, Pamela, that the care work that women workers or parents are taking on at home, which includes things like the teaching at home that's currently happening? And how do we gather data on this work when it isn't necessarily counted in this public sphere? I think that's a really interesting question, and maybe you're trying to do that right now in the second report.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say I'm not an economist. So take my.
But we know some really good economists.
We do know some really good economists, right? So just take it with a grain of salt, and I'm actually quoting what they've said. But some of the ones that I follow are Armin Yalnizyan, right? She's a great economist here in Ottawa, I think she's based, and Dr. Jennifer Robison. You can follow them all on Twitter. And one of the things that they've said is that actually that unpaid care work, there's no measurement for it. Like, it's not captured in GDP. It's not captured in any sort of that tangible, quantifiable way. But there's another report that I read from Oxfam, Time to Care, and they quantified global unpaid care work, and it was something around like $10 trillion and like 10 times the worth of Apple or something like that. So it goes back to what Anu and I were saying around, like, there's no data is really important, but really, really difficult to come across, which sort of underscores that point, how women's organizations in the sector are looked at, right? And so I think we definitely need that information to be able to, again, put policy recommendations forward. How that's going to happen, I'm not sure. We were going to have to tap into some really great economists out there.
Well, and I think there's two things that brings that I'm thinking about as you were talking, Pamela. One is that many of the community foundations have been doing reports on, and the most recent one, because they're trying to tie them to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And a couple of them have tried to not quantify unpaid works per se, but tried to find ways to quantify that unequal burden of unpaid work and how it's perceived in households, using some of the things that that Stats Canada and other provincial surveys have done. So I think that would be an important thing if people are really interested in that. But I think gathering data on this work would be an important role for Stats Can, actually, on sort of saying, when we're looking back and saying what happened during this pandemic, I would love to see a survey on care work specifically.
Yeah, and I think CCPA, right, one of our other co-authors, Catherine Scott, has done some really great work in sort of not directly capturing the unpaid work, but sort of how many hours are women losing, right, that they would be using to work versus, now using that time to care for the house, care for children, etc. So, and there's no direct data points, but I think there are some other data points that can come out. And we sort of address this a little bit in the second paper that we're writing, because talk about the economic impact of the pandemic and who lost jobs in which sector, and how that's been gendered. So, and the unpaid care work around that as well. So yeah, maybe something to read there.
Yeah, that's great. And then we have one more question, and I mean, I don't want, you don't have to answer it, but maybe we can talk about it. Because I don't think there's necessarily a direct answer here, but it says, given that gender-based analysis is not exactly the same thing as an intersectional lens, how do we reconcile these two framings in the policy recommendations? And I guess one thing I would say is they're not necessarily in the policy recommendations. It was more in the framing of the report as a whole. So the gender-based analysis plus was we were asking government to use that because they're already on the path, right? They made a commitment to it. There's historical reasons for them to have it in their policy work and in the legislation and whatever recovery packages they put together. And therefore, we just want to name it and sort of say, we're expecting to see this in the work you're doing, but it's absolutely not the same as an intersectional lens. So it's maybe, I don't know if you want to pick it up from there.
I sort of agree, with what you said. It wasn't particularly in our recommendations, but a way in which we co-authored the paper. And they aren't the same thing, right? And I think with the gender-based analysis, which I think we sort of pushed government on a little bit as well, is gender-based GBA plus is, you look at it from the gendered piece, and then you look at it from all the other pieces, right? Whereas intersectionality is around, you look at all aspects of identity, and actually you're centering those that are the most marginalized when it comes to identity, right? And I think both are very difficult to do, and to do consistently and to do it well. And we were funded through formerly Status of Women to do GBA plus work, but also we're wanting to do intersectional work. And I think the piece to remember as we move forward is, terminology is terminology. The most important thing is raising the floor for everyone, and that rights are not up high, right? If you are able to formulate policy recommendations that take into account the most marginalized, most vulnerable person, worker, community, it'll raise the floor for everybody, right? Especially when it comes to women's, when we think about policies that particularly take into account women or benefit women, it's, if you have family-friendly policies as an employer, that's going to help anybody who's a new parent, not just women, right? That's just one example, but yeah.
And I think it's an important one because there's often many things about disability too, right? That many of the things that have been put into place specifically to benefit disabled people or disabled women have made life easier for so many of us too. So I think it's important to say that's maybe what makes it more intersectional then, rather than sort of this idea that somehow there's a ladder or there's a layered effect. It's not that these are layered or that they're, it's a list. It's things that are happening at the same time and cannot actually be separated. And so putting them, as you said, centering those needs is really the best way forward, and maybe something we can address more specifically in the reports as we move ahead too. Yeah. Definitely. So I don't see any more questions from our Facebook Live folks, so I am going to start to wrap up the conversation. That you can read the report at www.canadianwomen'sfoundation.org, resetting, I guess that's a dash or a hyphen, normal. I wanted to say thank you very much, Pamela, for joining us today. It's been a really exciting conversation. I've really enjoyed the sort of back and forth. And it was lovely. I mean, I'm really happy that you, in particular, in the Ontario Nonprofit Network, took part in writing these reports and was really a co-author. So that's a really great honor for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and, having us involved in this paper and as well as the other one. And just, as we were talking about today, and some calls to actions and amplifying. So we encourage everybody who's on Facebook Live to really amplify the recommendations, right? There's so many of you that are doing such great work, such great policy and advocacy work. So if you can amplify any of the language or any of the recommendations that we put forth in the work that you're doing, that would be amazing. And the other two pieces just call to actions that we've had is just around that funding piece is so important around pushing for a federal resiliency grant program for nonprofits and charities, which include our women's organizations. So this would be a fund that anyone, like we're asking for a grant program that any of these organizations could apply for anything that they need to weather the pandemic. And then provincially, ONN has put forth a request for a stabilization fund for $689 million for, again, the sector to weather the storm, right? We already know there's systemic pieces that have created inequities for our organizations and our sector to meet the needs of communities, and the crisis is making it worse. So these stabilization efforts can help relieve some of that pressure and help them pivot, help them continue supporting organizations, and for that infrastructure to be there once this is all over in whatever way that might be, right? And look for our next paper. I think the care work paper is going to be super cool, and I'm really, really looking forward to launching that. Yeah, I mean, it has everything to do with how we're imagining the future of work now, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And I think another important thing to mention is if anybody would like to support an organization, everybody at the moment, if you have the capacity to make any support, please choose your favorite organization and support them at this time. If you'd like to make that organization the foundation, you can support the work we do across Canada, particularly the advocacy work we're doing, and that can happen by going to our website, canadianwomen.org, just as it can, I'm sure, for the Ontario Nonprofit Network also. So please do take a look at the work we're doing, and feel free to send us any other questions you have at other times. So thank you again, Pamela, and stay safe, everyone. Thanks a lot.